Hello, everyone, and welcome to iCritic Live. This is the podcast where we talk about our entertainment, pop culture, and life in between. I'm your host, Kevin T. Rodriguez, film critic of iCritic.net. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes of your time here with me today. And, the world of film lost a titan, one of the true visionaries of Hollywood. That was David Lynch when he died a few weeks ago. And I'm going to be honest, I haven't quite gotten over it. It still saddens me that David Lynch is no longer here. And I'd been wanting to do a tribute to David Lynch for a while, but I'm going to be honest, I haven't seen all of his films, and most of them I've seen once. I'm kind of starting to finally catch up on the David Lynch filmography, but I was turned to someone who actually wrote a book about David Lynch and seems to be an expert in Lynch's filmography. His name is Mike Miley, and thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So I first came across you with an intro at the Frida Cinema. I went to see Twin Peaks. Was it Walk with Fire? Is that what it's called?
Fire Walk with Me.
Fire Walk with Me. And so here's my Twin Peaks story. I have watched Twin Peaks for the first time in the last year, discovered it on Paramount Plus and was watching like an episode a week. On the day I went to see the movie, I had watched the final episode of Twin Peaks season 2 that afternoon. And then after that weird ending, I'm like, well, hopefully the movie will explain something tonight. And yeah, judging by your laughing, that was my response to it. Was like, oh, okay, I guess it's not really going to explain much, if anything. But that being said, it was a great movie. I mean, it was actually one of my favorite David Lynch films, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I am now in the middle of Twin Peaks: The Return.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm really loving that show, even if episode 8 was a little I mean, that was basically someone giving David Lynch too much money to do whatever the heck he wanted. I don't know how it's going to play out. I have said a couple times, man, what did you do to Agent Cooper? But I am enjoying it. But that's how you came on the show, hence why we have the background. And, one of the things that was about your intro that was very interesting, because when I started watching Twin Peaks for the first few episodes, I was recommending to my parents, my friends, like, oh my gosh, this old show has really held up very good. I'm intrigued by the mystery. And then it just got weirder. And the funny thing is, you said something, how it's like David Lynch kind of reclaimed it, like this is what it was supposed to be all along. I don't know. Do you, in hindsight, knowing that Twin Peaks was always going to turn into this strange pseudo horror show, was it ever really going to be a good fit for ABC?
I mean, I guess yes and no, right? I think, sure, it's a miracle that someone as experimental and idiosyncratic as David Lynch even winds up with a network show, period. Like, that's unheard of, especially for 1990. And even now, having auteurs do even prestige cable shows. I mean, it happens, but very few of them are as out there, so to speak, as Lynch is. And so there is that aspect of it where, like, this, of course, is not going to be a good fit for lowest common denominator programming in an age when there's 4 networks, right? That's the demands of that kind of schedule, and Lynch's sensibility are bound to be a bad fit over time. But at the same time, his sensibility, the themes that he's dealing with, and the ideas in his work, so much of it is very commercial. And I think that Twin Peaks is a great example of how much of his sort of central concerns and ideas he's able to get into a network show without really compromising on any of what he's talking about. I mean, sure, the violence and sexuality are in language are toned down, but look at that last episode of season 2 of Twin Peaks. That might be some of the most formally experimental work that he's done, period. And it was on ABC, right, on like a Wednesday night. So I think that kind of stuff shows how he was able to really balance the demands of the marketplace with the things that he wanted to do. And most of the time, it worked in his favor. And I think Twin Peaks is a great example of that, and just shows how much the stuff he was doing really struck a nerve with people. And so that they would go along with some of the weirder stuff, because it was getting at something that they sort of felt about the world around them in their bones, and so it winds up kind of building better viewers in the process, which is great.
And one of the things about the show that struck me, and this was actually quite a radical concept at the time, was even though some people said that, oh, the show went off the edge later on, and in some credit, maybe it did to a certain extent, but I kind of like the original idea, how it's like this fun little town with quirky characters and idiosyncratic dialogue and stuff was deep down hiding something quite evil and unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
And that the longer you stay there, not only are you exposed to it more, but you almost start to realize how everyone's basically playing a part in the town to kind of keep their own sanity for how they justify that they let this happen.
Yeah, 100%. Right. And I think that's what really, I guess, made people upset about when Fire Walk with Me came out, right? Because now, and I love hearing that your first reaction to seeing it after going through the original series was that you liked the movie, because most people who go in really jazzed about the show go into that movie, and myself included. First time I saw it when I was in high school, I was really let down and kind of upset that it wasn't all the things I liked about Twin Peaks. And instead it's this unrelentingly bleak and horrifying depiction of the last 7 days of this teenager, which like is exactly what I told you it was going to be. And you sort of realize, wait, this isn't, I don't enjoy this. This isn't what I came here for. But then like, that's what the show was all along. And like you just mentioned, the people in the town are sort of living in this, or active participants in this waking dream, more or less as a coping mechanism for all of the awful things that have been happening all around them that they choose to turn a blind eye to because it would be too horrifying to look at directly. And yet that's also kind of what everybody does in their own lives. We have to, in some ways, construct some kind of imaginary version of events around us, because to look at it directly would be too traumatic. And so it really is kind of holding a mirror up to ourselves, which makes Fire Walk with Me a much more unpleasant experience, because it is more direct, even though it is also weirder and more experimental. It's way more upfront about what it's depicting, and the show wasn't.
Right. And I also was really fascinated by how Laura was basically the good girl during day, but had her dark secrets. But then when she's bringing her friend in, she's horrified that her friend's actually getting involved in how she lives, because she doesn't like the way she lives. And it's like, boy, isn't that, there's just so much truth in all of this. So I found it very good. Now, another reason why, I know we started off strong on Twin Peaks, and we'll get to other stuff, I promise.
Yeah, sure.
Agent Cooper is one of the great, I think, TV characters of all time. I hope there's not necessarily like a happy ending when I finish season 3, but at least a fitting ending. I was surprised, even though it was disappointing that he wasn't like in the movie very, very much. I also liked how in the show, like, he was losing himself in the town.
Yeah.
Like, he comes in, oh, this is nice, I'm gonna get, and so he brought a lot of charm. But then, like, I think the final shot, like, I think the town had finally gotten to him.
Yeah.
And like, I haven't finished season 3, but I sensed shortly after that he got out and he realized he needed to get out because it was sucking away at him. And in the movie, I thought it was interesting that his part was basically like, when she died, she realized he was going to be the one to bring justice to her, and that was going to be her peace. And that's how they have that connection connection.
Yeah. Oh, I like that reading of the ending. That's really good. Yeah, I don't want to really
Yeah, we
necessarily
don't want to
spoil anything
spoil.
for you for season 3, but what I will say is season 3 is kind of doing a similar thing with Cooper, with the Twin Peaks fan and viewer, that Fire Walk with Me is doing to the Twin Peaks fan and viewer with Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of anti-fan service for a very important purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah, no. It's well, that makes me happy. I've actually been making it a point, watch 1 or 2 episodes a week, and it has to be at night after 9 p.m. with the lights off because it just kind of has a feeling
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
night, I think. Now, I guess we'll comment on this one viewer. Rentrek says the fact that the thumbnail has him sucking down a cig is darkly hilarious. And yeah, let's address that because we all know that he had like emphysema and things like that. I think it's been confirmed that because he lived in like the LA fires area, the smoke caused complications to his health, and that's very unfortunate. But you know, the reality is, he, like Bette Davis, you rarely saw him without a cigar or cigarette in his hand. So I mean, it's kind of yeah. I know the circumstances of his death, but to not include a picture like that would kind of be like when the U.S. Post Office did the Bette Midler postage stamp, but they removed her cigarette. It's like you can just tell there would be something dishonest about it because you almost never saw her without it.
Yeah, and his public statement after announcing his emphysema is is a pretty frank and honest. I mean, it's just like I love lighting things on fire, and I loved this. It's compromised my health now, but I that's the life I wanted to live, and I'm gonna live with this next stage of my life as well. So I thought it was a pretty a pretty frank and honest way to deal with that announcement.
Yeah, right. Now, I want to pick your brain about something. Now, admittingly, the last major thing he did was he was cameoed in Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans, which is that's a great movie, by the way, folks. Don't let anyone tell you it's boring. If you love filmmaking, that's like a film historian, filmmaker's wet dream of a movie.
Oh yeah, that's a top 5 Spielberg, easy.
Yeah,
easily.
Now, Lynch is playing John Ford, and I'm going to state this right now because I know that this one's definitely like a blurring of life and art. I don't know if Spielberg actually met John Ford. I don't know if this was the advice.
Oh, it is 100%. Yeah, that is a true story. Oh yeah,
that's a true story. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Even so, the fact that David Lynch said it where he's talking about the horizon, it's like, where's the horizon? It's back there. Where's the horizon? It's close. It's like, if it's far away, it's interesting. If it's close, it's interesting. If it's steady, it's boring as, and we're going to not say that because it's a family show. That kind of feels like the philosophy Lynch himself would have with most of his movies, where it's like, he's not, and I actually wrote this in my Lost Highway review, which I did give a negative review, but this applies to a lot of movies. He seems more interested in the presentation and the mystery. It's like he doesn't care about the solution so much. He doesn't always care about like wrapping it all up. It's like, look, it's going to be strange. It's not going to always make sense. It might even be a little back there, a little too close, but it's going to be interesting. And I think that even so, if John Ford said that, it just kind of seems like that was a philosophy Lynch had. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty inspired choice on Spielberg's part because it seems like it's out of left field to have David Lynch play John Ford. Like they seem like, Ford's movies are these sort of mythic pieces of Americana. It's like sort of good guys and bad guys, and so much of it, it's not this dark, morally ambiguous universe for the most part. I mean, there's some exceptions to this.
Movies like Stagecoach and How Green With My Valley, which both are good. Just gonna state like people would like How Green Was My Valley a lot more if it didn't win Best Picture over Citizen Kane, but those are the kind of movies John Ford made.
Yeah, well, and like but at the same time, they both, I mean, Lynch too has this mythic sense of Americana. It's just not the sort of the version of it that Ford does, but Spielberg kind of sees in them, I think, a similar way of myth and image making that they get into. And so I think that part's a really great choice. And then also to what you're saying about the composition advice that Ford gives to Spielberg and that Lynch gets to vocalize, the look and feel of the thing is everything, right? And I guess some of that comes from his training as a painter, but also I think it's the basic thing that I would tell students when we'd watch a David Lynch movie is, these movies really show you that you don't have to understand what's going on to feel something very deeply, right? Like I can't explain everything that happens in Mulholland Drive or Eraserhead, but I know that every time I watch them, I feel something very important.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I feel tells me a lot more about me and what I'm responding to than being able to connect every plot hole, in a description, right? And so I think that kind of resistance to explanation and closure winds up being his work's greatest strength, because it gets us asking questions about ourselves, the world around us, art, etc., that lead to really interesting places, a whole lot more interesting than like, okay, well, so what happened to so and so in this scene, right?
Right. Like what does the final line in Mulholland Drive? Was it Sicario or Silencio?
Silencio, yeah.
Silencio, like, what's that mean? And it's like one of the few times where it's like, honestly, I don't really think it matters. So sometimes, right. I mean, I always kind of tell people like with Mulholland Drive, it's like, look, it's in some ways it's kind of like The Usual Suspects, where it's like the twist at the end of The Usual Suspects leads you to rethink the whole movie. It's like, well, does this make sense now? Does this make sense? And sometimes it's like, well, at the end, I don't know if it matters because the journey was so compelling.
Yeah.
As long as I mean, I think Roger Ebert wrote about The Usual Suspects, to the extent I understand it, I don't care. But I'm always like, well, to the extent I understand it, I emotionally react to it.
Yeah, it's almost flipping it the other way around. To the extent that I don't understand it, I do care, right? Yeah. Like that's the David Lynch version of it. I don't get what's going on, but I care about it a lot, and I really I'm feeling a lot right now. Yeah.
Right. Now, when I was growing up, my parents had some pretty strict rules. I was actually not allowed to watch PG-rated films until I was 10. Granted,
okay.
This is the 90s. A PG-rated film usually held weight. Let's be honest. It's not like today where it's like there's PG is basically a G-rated film. Like, does Fozzie Bear wearing fart shoes really warrant the Muppets being PG? But what? They've got the MPAA has gotten way draconian about that. But when I was 10, it opened up my vision for more. Well, I guess I missed a step because I can only watch G-rated films. I watched a lot of classic films. You almost had to because the family section was small. Yeah. When I got to, are you still here?
I am still here. Yes, welcome back.
Thank you. So that's normally what I'd be saying. So we had an internet blackout.
Oh no.
So I am so sorry. That is the first time this has ever happened on this show. If it happens again, hopefully you'll be up to doing a part 2 later on down the road. But for the time being.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, whatever you need.
That was just so unfortunate.
Thank you. So I guess when you cut out, you were mentioning, I guess it was probably pretty early in the story, but about how you were mostly just seeing G-rated stuff until you were 10.
Yeah,
that's sort of the last thing that came through.
Yeah, so when I turned 10, that opened up a world of possibilities. Except for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, my parents considered that a PG-13.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say it's the first, but one of the first that I saw was The Elephant Man. Because it was like, Drew's like, okay, it's PG, it's black and white. Mom and Dad will probably say yes to this. They did. We watched it, and not gonna lie, that movie kind of wrecked a little 10-year-olds.
Yeah, it wrecks 80-year-olds. I mean, that's a big jump up from G to P, and from the Rescuers Down Under or something like that to The Elephant Man. That's a big jump.
But I was definitely like caught by like not only the visuals but the music and the acting and the way how he shot it, where it's like it kind of felt like it was from John's point of view, and that his world was so bleak. This is what the world looked like to him every day, and it was, and so it's like then because I was a kid who like I think my uncle taught me this like. If you like a movie, look at the director. It's not the star that makes the movie. It's the writer and the director. So I looked, the internet was still fairly new, but I looked up David Lynch. It's like, oh, I want to see more David Lynch movies. Well, those hopes were dashed pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could not, my parents would not let me rent Eraserhead. They would not let me rent Blue Velvet. And you know, from everything I've heard, probably for the best.
Yeah. Those are definitely not for tweens. But I guess was this before or after the Straight Story had come out?
This was before the Straight Story,
Okay.
and the funny story about the Straight Story. This is like almost a good segue. We went to see, this was the opening day of Pokemon, the first movie.
Okay.
Yeah. Now on the billboard, there was a Straight Story. And the reason it stood out to everyone was because that was also rated G. And like there was a comment, there's rarely 2 G-rated films in theaters at the same time. And we went inside, there was a Straight Story poster, looked, and I saw a David Lynch film. And it's like, I know that name. And it's like, okay, I want to see this now. And the Straight Story was, well, there's a joke you can make, like, well, that's Lynch's most straightforward film. In some ways, it didn't feel like a David Lynch movie because, it was all wholesome and everything. But in another way, it kind of did feel like a David Lynch film, how it was still like, okay, we're going to follow this old man on a tractor of all scene. We're going to look at the world a little differently. And the whole journey aspect felt very dreamlike.
Yeah.
If you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one that it took me a while to come around and see all the stuff that he's really up to in that movie. And I guess what does make it jump out a little bit is, I mean, it's written by his partner at the time, Mary Sweeney, but it wasn't developed as a property for him to direct. She was pursuing it on her own, and then he kind of came in and decided that he wanted to direct it after initially it was just going to serve as like in a producerial role. And so he's more, for lack of a better term, a director for hire for that rather than being the originator of the project. But at the same time, it is, when you look at it very closely, it is very much a David Lynch film in terms of it's as much about trauma as Fire Walk With Me is about trauma. It's just exploring it in a slightly different way. And where Twin Peaks, or as you'll see later this evening, Blue Velvet is about taking that sunshiny world and maybe digging into the dark underbelly of it. We never go in the Straight Story into the dark underbelly. Instead, all that stuff comes up on its own. Right. There's no descent, but all of those things are there. For all of the characters, but especially for Alvin. I mean, that guy's story, his life is just sort of one traumatic thing after another that he just has to carry with him all the time. Right.
And it's something that you always hate to say, like just get to the end and it'll make sense, because it's like sometimes, us snooty critics act like, oh yeah, even if you're not getting it now, you'll get it at the end. But in this case, like it really is, because aside from the traumas he's holding, he's insistent, I have to do the journey this way, even though it's like, well, why don't you just let this nice couple pick you up and take you the last 20 miles? Like, what's it really going to hurt? And I guess we're talking about spoilers now, but he shows up to his brother's house. His brother doesn't seem very happy to see him. And he looks at that lawnmower and is like, you mean to tell me you drove all the way on that thing to come see me? And Alvin's like, yes. And then his brother seems genuinely touched that he went to that effort to see him. And it's like, no, yeah, it clicks at the end.
Yeah.
And he this was not only a journey to see his brother, this was in some way atoning. This was for the sins. Like, this was in some ways his punishment for letting the relationship deteriorate to the way it did. And he was going to show his brother, I'm going to do this almost really stupid self-punishment thing, but I'm going to suffer through it. And you're going to see how much I truly regret how things turned out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and then of course, along the way, he gets to help other people, like, you know, that teenage girl who ran away. And it's like, you know, the way when he talks about these things, it's like, you can tell he's lived some things. And it's like, well, I've sat where you are, kid. Let me explain where this is going to lead you to. And dare I say it, even though it's his only G-rated film, it might be his most mature adult film in some ways.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think it's often like, I wish it were treated, if it's going to be treated as an outlier in his filmography, I wish it were treated as an outlier in the sense of how you're talking about it, where it is about its sophistication and maturity of theme and sense of purpose and all of that, not just the, oh, well, it's got a G rating and everything else is a pretty hard R. Because on one level, that's not seeing like what's actually going on. In another, it's kind of, to a certain degree, not true, right? Because Twin Peaks, I mean, it's a network show. I mean, it's not necessarily a G-rated network show, but like, it's passing standards and practices and all of the sorts of things like that. So he's worked in this in a so-called tamer production model before.
Right. He's used to answering to suits who say you can't do that and you can't do that. He's used to listening to suits saying you have to reveal the killer to boost the ratings, even though I figured out pretty early the show was not about who murdered the girl. And that's kind of why I was drawn to it.
Yeah.
But and so I don't know if you have any unique insights, because, you know, there's like sometimes in movie deals where it's like you would like to go and like, I wanted to be a fly in the wall to find out how that came together. And it always like, you know, like, how did David Lynch end up directing a film for Disney? It kind of feels like John Waters making Hairspray, which, you know, he did, but it's like, you look at the rest of the thing, it's like, how the heck did that happen?
Right. Yeah. And I confess, I don't know. It may have been something that was financed and produced independently that then Disney picked up after it had been completed. I don't know if it was always a Disney picture or not, because it does have the involvement of, I think, the French producer Alain Sard, who also winds up coming in and rescuing Mulholland Drive after ABC rejects the pilot. So it may have started out as an independent production that Disney came and did a negative pickup on, or something like that.
Yeah. And even if they picked it up, it's like, I'm surprised they released it under the Disney banner, because it's like, this isn't I mean, yeah, it's safe for kids. I guess it's technically a family film, but it's like, I can imagine like a lot of parents, their kids getting so bored, they got up and left. It's like, why wouldn't you put it under Touchstone or Miramax?
Right. Yeah. Well, because we're a good 10 years away from like something like Up, you know, where where kids might take more of an interest in a movie about an elderly man, but even that's an animated film with and all of those, it's got all sorts of other things in it besides just older characters.
Right. Yeah. I mean, although kids definitely got more attention, like, you know, just a side note, I remember the 2 times I saw Wall-E in theaters, if I was an executive, I'm going to be honest, I would say you got to have more dialogue in the first half of this movie, because kids are going to get bored and they're going to be loud in the theater. But both times I saw the movie, it was silent except for the appropriate times it was laughing. So that gave me a lot of hope that kids' attention spans were growing. I don't know if I feel so confident anymore, because we've seen like a literal decline in attention spans where people are like on their phones all the time and they almost can't sit and watch a long form thing. Yeah, if David Lynch lived and made another film, would general audiences have the patience to sit through it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the audiences for his theatrical films was never, particularly large, right? So I guess it's always kind of coming out in a more specialty market sort of thing. So maybe it wouldn't be an issue in the same way that Wall-E might have. But then again, even with something like Wall-E coming out today, I guess it's
I think the robot will
good stories,
talk.
maybe, but I think also good stories well told. People forget that all the other bells and whistles that they're maybe used to aren't there.
Yeah.
And
I think the reason David Lynch survived was because A, his movies were typically cheap, and two, most of them were not huge box office successes. Elephant Man was an exception, I know, but they were cheap enough that they could survive. Like, well, if you can make at least like $5 million at the box office and we sell the right airings to HBO and we put it on VHS, we could probably turn a little profit in that.
Yeah, the home video market would certainly a saving grace for a lot of films like this, and I guess too, soundtracks and all the other sort of ancillary revenue streams that movies were able to pursue in the 90s.
That's true.
And
I used to buy soundtrack CDs.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I guess the Lost Highway soundtrack, I think, crossed over to 500,000 copies. Like, it's a very successful soundtrack. Now, this is maybe also where we can kind of see how, he was having difficulty getting funding for the things he wanted to do from streaming services. Even being such an established big name auteur, Netflix not being super interested
so there was like, your thoughts on that? Netflix paid tribute to David Lynch's passing, calling him a genius whose work will never be matched. And there were so many people who retweeted and commented, like, so why didn't you fund the last movie he was pitching to you guys?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it costs them nothing to put out that tweet. And I guess they're still looking at their bottom line, sending out something like that, right? The same reason that they wouldn't fund the production. Oh, it costs too much. Well, then if saying it costs you so little, then it also, the weight of what you're saying says very little too. Right.
Right. Well, Netflix got indirectly roasted at the Academy Awards when Sean Baker won Best Director and talked about the theatrical experience and how movies fans are built in the theater. They're not made on streaming services. And like the camera cut to Ted Sarandos real quick, who was just kind of like,
well, yeah. And I saw an interesting stat, and I don't know like if it necessarily played a role or not, but Anora was one of the only movies that sent physical screeners to members of all of the three major awards bodies. Like the awards where it cleaned up, they sent screeners out, as opposed to the digital links that require you to download an app and enter the code and then, try to figure out how the heck you're going to watch it. And I don't know if that necessarily has a direct correlation to its success, but I mean, it's not nothing if you can just, I can just put this in and watch it right now, as opposed to jumping through all these other hoops and digging through my email and my spam folder. Like,
I'm sure it helped. Another thing that helps is like Anora plays just as good at home as in theaters, whereas Wicked, The Brutalist, and Dune Part 2 especially, it's like the bigger screen might add some weight to that. But speaking of the Academy Awards, I am going to... Now, look, I know that the In Memoriam section is like probably the most thankless job in the world, because you're always going to have to skip someone and things like that. I'm very surprised that the Academy could find time to do a 6-minute or so James Bond tribute after doing one a few years ago. But even with Laura Dern and Isabella Rossellini wearing her blue velvet dress, even I know enough to know what she was doing there. They couldn't have them come on and say a few words about David Lynch. He was in the In Memoriam section, but it's like, guys, it seems like this deserves its own little section like Gene Hackman got. I'm sure you agree with me, but why would you think that they wouldn't take that opportunity?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question, and yeah, and I mean, I guess it's sort of the in memoriam segment always feels too short to me, because, and especially the the this year's cohort, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, was particularly stacked with some really big names,
Right. They
and
really should have extended it an extra minute at least.
right,
I think we would have
yeah.
survived. No
Yeah,
pun
and I mean
intended.
it's the bigger challenge that I guess the Academy always sort of has to have about how much emphasis to place on their history versus how much to put in the here and now. But it feels more tone deaf alongside something like the Bond segment, right? I mean, I think the Quincy Jones segment, fantastic, right? Because that's someone was a recipient of an honorary Oscar this year and also passed away, right?
Mhm.
So that kind of made a lot more sense versus this strange sort of. I mean, the Broccolis also had won an honorary Oscar, so I get the move there, but it does augur something kind of strange when it's also it just had a prominent sale to a streaming, to Amazon, where it's like, what is happening here?
Right.
Yeah.
They made some Amazon jokes as well. Just very, and
Mm-hmm.
this is especially weird because the Academy, they might not have always given David Lynch films a lot of Oscar nominations. The most notable one was The Elephant Man, which got
Mm-hmm.
10.
Yeah.
But David Lynch would kind of pop up and, if you will, crash the party by being the sole nominee
Mm-hmm.
for director. I think he did it with
Mm-hmm.
Blue Velvet and
Mm-hmm.
Mulholland Drive, where it's like,
Yeah.
well, how can an Academy who liked him so much that they would make him the sole nominee of this movie? It's very rare for a Best Director nomination. The only other time I
Yeah.
can think of off the top of my head was when Martin Scorsese got a director nomination for The Last Temptation of the Christ. But
Mm-hmm.
even Paul Greengrass, who got a director nomination, United 93 got a Best Editing nomination as well. The
Mm-hmm.
directors rarely come alone. And
Mm-hmm.
Lynch did it
Mm-hmm.
like 3 times. So
Yeah.
why would the Academy not want to spend a few minutes highlighting that, like saying, David Lynch was so amazing that he would get in even when his movies wouldn't.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that and I guess there's certainly the larger I mean, with Mulholland Drive in particular, kind of that's the story of sort of pulling this thing out of the ashes, right, from a rejected TV pilot to a major work of cinema, is but I think maybe the bigger thing too is that's sort of related to that is how many of people who acted in his films didn't get broader recognition for their performances, when a lot of actors kind of give some of the best performances of their career in his work. Whether that is Cheryl Lee, of course, but Naomi Watts certainly, or
Yeah, he saved her career. He really did.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of, well, what could have, when you see her in that film and then look at her subsequent work, there's a sense of, well, what could have been, like, why isn't she getting the roles and the performances that that this film demonstrates she can clearly do? That's another thing that's sort of disappointing there. But I mean, you run through all of his films have someone in them who is delivering the performance of their career, and that is an often overlooked thing, I think, in talking about his work as a director, because of so much of the other stuff with mood and style and everything. But as a director of actors, he's clearly at the top of the heap, because you have all of these people who deliver terrific performances every single time,
Right.
even though there's all these jokes about the kind of strange direction that he will give the actors. It obviously works, right? It gets them to the place they need to be, whether they are puzzled by what he's telling them or not. The proof is up there on the screen that he is directing them incredibly well.
Right. And heck, now it dawns on me, Denis Villeneuve was there, and he could have come up and said, like, look, you're honoring me with nominating Dune Part 2 for Best Picture, but I would also like to say there was another filmmaker who attempted to tackle this book before me. Now, that might have been a little awkward because, and I'm curious to know your thought. I don't like Dune. David Lynch's Dune. That is such an ugly film. Really, like, and that's actually unpleasant. I mean, you could argue that David Lynch's films tend to be unpleasant in some ways, but like Dune seemed unpleasant in a very unique way, where it's like this is almost sad to watch. I'm sure that was a lesson in, like, I guess I'm not a mainstream film director. But what do you think of?
Yeah, I mean, I still like that movie. I know it's a flawed thing, but I guess it's a big nostalgia thing for me, where that was the first David Lynch movie I saw when I was really young in theaters. I should not have been brought to the movie probably, but I'm glad that I was.
I'm surprised that was rated PG-13.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely getting away with some stuff, in there with some imagery that they are sort of deliberately ignoring what it looks like and stuff like that. But yeah, it's I still dig it for those sorts of reasons, and it has some I think regardless, and this is a thing I guess I would say, since I know you're going to go see Blue Velvet later tonight, Dune may be the most important film of his career, and here's why. It's a disastrous experience for him, and it's not well received. And he decides at the end of that process, I am not making another movie unless I have final cut. Like, that's it. I'm not doing it. And Dino De Laurentiis, who produced Dune, had him signed to a 2-picture deal. And I guess De Laurentiis maybe felt a little bad or something about how it had gone as well, and told him, I'm going to honor the 2-picture deal, and you can come make Blue Velvet at this studio that I'm building in North Carolina for a very, very low budget, obviously not the budget of Dune, and you can have final cut if you keep the movie to under 2 hours. And Blue Velvet is 1 frame short of 2 hours long. Spoiler alert, the closing credits, it's like 2 columns of credits to get it to under 2 hours.
I've heard like filmmakers do things like that, like on watching the commentary for the Torch Song trilogy. Harvey Fierstein was forced to keep that movie 2 hours, play was 4 hours, and he deliberately made it 2 hours and 1 second so that if they wanted to keep their logo in there, they have to let it be a second above. So you weren't the first person who Dune was the first. So I mean, in that sense, that's where Dune's a good thing. Now, I disagree that David Lynch's Dune is better than the Denis Villeneuve one. I think it's pretty clear that Denis Villeneuve is better. But do you know what this Spice Divers alternative Redux version is?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different cuts of Dune that you can kind of find here and there, either bootlegged cuts or fan edits or things like that from available material that people have found, because Lynch has had a longer cut that got hacked down to the 2 hour and 20-minute version that is there, and they have resurfaced it a variety of times. There was a televised version that is credited as being directed by Alan Smithy rather than Lynch, that has some of that footage put in, but it's not really his cut. And so you've got some versions like that. They played it on like the Sci-Fi Channel in the late 90s when they had that that remake of the TV movie version of Dune with William Hurt. That, in anticipation of that, they played it on TV at one point. But yeah, you can find versions of these things online. I've never like really gone through and like tracked one down to rewatch it or to watch it. Like I probably should at some point, but I do kind of sometimes I just want to stick with the version that's an official release and things like that.
Yeah, well, unless the director comes out and says this is the version I would prefer you watch, like Terry Gilliam in Brazil.
Sure.
Like, he hates the Love Conquers All edition, and like he's pretty clear that that's why I like the Criterion Collection. It has all the different cuts and things like that. Yeah. So I don't know if it's worth it, Mike and I critic. Well, I might try it. I mean, I don't know if, because the problem is like the theatrical cut is so unpleasant to watch that it's like the idea of watching a 3 hour version or whatever. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
shoot me now. Now, that being said, because his work was divisive, but
Hmm.
there was one, I'm sure you've stumbled upon it. There was at least one critic who seemed to have a particular vendetta against him. Ironically, one of my favorite film critics, the guy who inspired me to do all this, Roger
Hmm.
Ebert,
Sure.
famously didn't give David Lynch a good review until The Straight Story. And
Hmm.
I think only that and Mulholland Drive were
Yeah.
the only two positive reviews he gave, including movies like The Elephant Man, which was strange because it's like that seems like something he would
Hmm.
like. I mean, I don't know. How do you explain that the most famous film critic in America, like just like seemed to have a real bone to pick with Lynch?
Yeah. I don't know. I think I read his reviews of Lynch's work, and I mean they make sense. His point of view and his reasons and all that makes sense to me. I just don't agree with him.
Hmm.
So it's illuminating, even if um, it doesn't work for me. And it's interesting how I think, and it's been a long time since I've kind of gone back and looked at some of this stuff, but a lot of the filmmakers who clearly benefited from the road that Lynch paved, Ebert does like, right? Like
Hmm.
Tarantino or the Coen brothers, or some other,
Yep. Or
and he's
Sean Baker.
very,
Sean Baker
very,
also.
very savvy about them, and doesn't necessarily pick up on the the correlation, right, between the two. But
Yeah,
uh,
shows that no
you
one's
know,
perfect.
yeah. Well, and two, I guess a lot of it's really rare that the a lot of the all-time greats are universally well received when they first arrive. It takes people a long time to catch up to really see the work for what it is and what it's doing. I mean, Fire Walk with Me is a perfect example of this, right? That's probably the most reviled and poorly reviewed movie that Lynch made. Yet now, in the last 5-10 years or so, it's very rapidly been sort of rising in people's esteem as perhaps his greatest work, and
Well,
that's a big swing from, like one of the worst films of the year to perhaps one of the greatest works by one of the greatest directors
uh,
around, right? So
well,
it takes time.
his best film is still Mulholland Drive, but I do think that but the Twin Peaks movie is definitely top five. I mean, your intro probably helped a little bit when I saw it because it was, but I had accepted going into the movie that if it's probably going to be weird because it's like I was watching the show and it's like, well, it's not going to go back to the beginning of the show.
Hmm.
This, if it's heading in a certain direction, it's going to keep going in that direction.
Hmm.
hey, hey, Mel. So glad to see you. Now, I also have not seen Inland Empire.
Oh yeah.
I'm That's another one. Best film is Dune and Blue Velvet for me. Well, I'm seeing Blue Velvet tonight. I will have to see if I agree. I'm sorry, I just do not like Dune. Inland Empire seems to be one of his. That was like his final film, right?
Hmm.
That he made,
Yeah.
and that one seemed to be pretty divisive. So without
Hmm.
spoiling too much, I
Yeah.
guess, would you would you believe that Inland Empire was going out on a high note, a low note, or maybe somewhere in the middle?
I mean, I think it's a high note, but I also
Okay.
feel like most of his films, or pretty much all the films, are high notes, right? So, but no,
Right.
I had a pretty
Well,
profound viewing experience with Inland Empire when I saw it in the theater. I was very deeply moved by it, and it it's interesting to see an artist who I guess at that point would have been in his late 50s, early 60s, I guess, suddenly just picking up digital video and playing around with it. There's something kind of fun about that. But no, I thought that was a very intense theatrical experience, and it really, if you're, it's closest maybe in its sort of vibe. If you were going for like a hybrid of, if Mulholland Drive got treated the way Twin Peaks: The Return is treated, that's maybe where you kind of have the vibe of Inland Empire. Um, it's but yeah, I think that there's there's one scene near the end of the movie that's maybe the most emotionally affecting thing in Lynch's filmography for me, and so that I think it's a
hmm,
really a real powerful statement about the relationship that we have to art and why we look for art, why art moves us, things like that. It's a very and it's a very different approach for him that that I think really makes it worthwhile.
Okay. By the way, I will say the Lost Highway soundtrack is definitely one of the better soundtracks.
Yeah, it rips.
Of the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about the movies, and the thing was, I'm not even not having seen Inland Empire, I'm actually gonna ask Frida Cinema, like, are you guys gonna show this as well? Because if you are, I'm gonna hold off on opening my Criterion set. I do believe that movies are best experienced for the first time in theaters, if possible.
Yeah.
Possible. And I'm glad for movie places like the Frida and the Art and the Lemleys for keeping classic cinema alive. I actually might see Witness for the Prosecution in theaters on Saturday.
Nice.
I've seen that before, but it would be nice.
But still,
that.
Yeah, that I think I saw Inland Empire at a Limley. I saw it at the Limley in Pasadena. That's where it was playing when I saw it, and I had also seen it at the the Arrow in Santa Monica. Those were a couple of places I'd gone to see when I lived out in LA.
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen a movie at the Arrow yet. I don't know if it's still around. We lost so many theaters during COVID.
Oh yeah, I think it's still the American Cinematheque runs it. I know they lost the Egyptian and they're at the Los Feliz 3, but
and then Netflix bought it and restored it, so now it's used as their one of their 4-year consideration. Got mixed feelings.
That's a great theater. I mean, that was my favorite theater in LA was the Egyptian. I really loved that that place.
Definitely got mixed feelings about Netflix owning it. It's like, well, I'm glad it survives. At the same time, I'd like to watch. But anyway, so now that we talk about the films, we cannot end the episode without talking about the greatest final act David Lynch ever did, directing his coffee commercials and co-starring on the Cleveland Show. In all seriousness. So what do you think about that's what his career became at the end, selling coffee and voicing a kind of self-parody of himself?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think there's probably a whole different book that someone ought to write about the way that he adapted to the digital era and the way that he sort of cultivated or created a certain kind of brand, even when he wasn't really, that was at its strongest when he wasn't really making films anymore. I think certainly he's an early adopter of the internet with davidlynch.com and the things that he would do on that website. And
I saw some of that stuff. It was
right. But like, so, he's doing this in like the early 2000s, and some of that material winds up in being part of Inland Empire and stuff like that. So, I mean, he's got that sort of thing going on. And then, the guest spots on like Cleveland Show, Family Guy, Louie, all sorts of other kind of programs where he is basically playing, if not himself, the broader public's idea of what he must be like or who he is, right?
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic way to keep himself in the forefront of people's imaginations and all of that when he's not necessarily making work, so that by the time we are in the 2020s and he gets back to doing the weather reports on his YouTube channel, right? People know him and have seen him, even who maybe haven't seen one of his films or have only seen a couple of them. They may have encountered him first, like as a meme, basically. And there's maybe some aspect of that might seem kind of silly, but I think all of it is incredibly true to who he is and what his sensibility was. It wasn't a caricature of himself in the way that maybe other artists or performers had to kind of settle into doing some kind of, I mean, I guess I'm thinking like of someone like Orson Welles or something like that, right? It's not like the stuff that he was doing in his 60s and 70s was, as far as those public appearances and things like that, was particularly honoring his best work, right? I mean, it just wasn't the situation that he was in. Whereas Lynch was able to kind of do it in a way that only intensified his artistic persona in a way that you would not expect someone entering his 60s and 70s to be in command of new media in the way that he was, and sort of being a trailblazer for it. And I would love to see somebody try to figure out how he did that, because it's incredibly business savvy for someone who also is wholeheartedly dedicated to the uncompromising art life, wound up finding a way to be incredibly adaptive to the new market that was developing around him.
Yeah, if someone wants to write that book, please do. And by the way, before anyone comments while listening to this, yes, I am fully aware that he directed all of Twin Peaks: The Return. We talked about that earlier. It's just, I sometimes wonder how many film fans realize that David Lynch played a bartender in the Cleveland show. Like, it was just like, and I mean, also, this just goes to show how almost out of touch with other people I was, because when my friends would watch the Cleveland show and I say, "Oh, I love that David Lynch is voicing himself," and they're like, "Who's David Lynch?" And it's like, directed when I told them, this is a great story to end on. Like, I told them, what kind of movies he made. Like, oh, so he made a bunch of old movies that people don't remember. And I'm like, and I said, "Do you really think that?" And they're like, "Well, they don't sound like." Okay, so you're gonna come to my house this Sunday. We're gonna sit down and we're gonna watch Mulholland Drive, and it's gonna kick your ass. And sure enough, it did that.
Yep.
And they were like, "Oh my gosh!" It's like, what else has he made?
Yeah.
So his work will go on. And by the way, folks, if you want to read a book about his work, you can get Mike's book, David Lynch's American Dreamscape. It's in paperback and hardback, although the hardback is a little expensive.
Yeah, that's just for university libraries. That's not for the average user. Yeah, so don't buy the hardback.
Okay, but yeah, you can buy it here, and read more about his work there. And just to let you know, for those who gave me flack about the cigarette, on his cover, David Lynch lighting up a cigarette. The man was known for smoking. I don't know what to say. As for everyone else,
it's a great photo. Yeah.
As for everyone else, if this is your first time here listening to this podcast and you like what you hear, technical difficulties in the middle aside, hey, why don't you make it official? We're on Spotify, Apple, Deezer, all the podcasts of choice. You can check us out on YouTube. And Mike, thank you once again for spending this time with me. And as always, everyone, I will see you at the movies. Take care.
Hey, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for making it to the end. Just a few more things. First of all, the names that you see on the screen, these are our Patreon and YouTube member supporters. And I thank each and every one of them. Their support helps me make exclusive videos for Patreon and YouTube members, as well as keep the channel running. And of course, is just a huge kindness to me. Also, don't forget to check out the iCritic-led podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google, Deezer, whatever podcasting service you listen to. It is there. We definitely want to see you there. And hey, there's also other videos that you can check out. So, check out these other channels, these other videos, especially that one. I think that's a really good one.